Alright guys, welcome to today's video. In this one I'm going to be speaking about spinning kicks and how I basically understand spinning kicks, how I like to think about them in my own practice. Now there's a consensus that these kicks are kind of flashy and just for display and aren't really applicable in combat situations, but from what I've observed that always comes from people that aren't really skilled enough at them to kind of like make that judgment anyway. So if you're not skilled at something, you haven't really got that as an option available. So you're going to judge it based on your own level of skill. Because if we observe anybody who knocks somebody out or really utilizes these techniques effectively in combat, they're always very, very high level at these techniques. They're not ever beginners. And that's because these techniques are really difficult and require a really high skill level in order to make them applicable. Now, with that being said, these techniques are very difficult to land simply because of the big rotational movement. And that goes for whether you're an expert in them or a complete beginner. So whatever level you're at, you're going to need to utilize some kind of feint before you initiate the technique in order to lure an opponent into a false sense of security. Now that can be something like, a popular one might be throwing, say, a fake hook punch before you spin into that spinning hook kick or back kick. Or it can be something even as simple as sort of stepping backwards to give the impression that you're retreating, bringing the opponent forward and then suddenly exploding into a spinning hook kick. Before any of that though, you need to be able to execute these techniques at will very quickly on a dime. So many people might be, say, bouncing around and moving, and they always have to kind of like reset their center of gravity in their body before they throw this kick, and that's obviously going to be super readable. Now, regardless of what level you're at, there's always going to be some level of set, but becoming more proficient and comfortable with the technique means that set's going to be minimized, and obviously the bigger the set, the more readable it is. So we're going to be looking to be able to execute those techniques consistently the same way each time with a minimal set. And what that does is basically make the feints that we're using before those techniques much more effective. So we're still going to be using a feint, obviously, even if we're super proficient in these techniques, but it's no use, say, if you're not very experienced or the kick itself isn't very good, to throw a really nice feint to hide it, but then it takes you an age to complete the technique anyway. It's going to be useless. So you need to get both parts of the puzzle in there to make it an effective technique. And when I say efficient, I basically mean no wasted movement in the technique. So everything you're doing at each stage of that kick serves a purpose, and this is just done through consistent practice and repetitions. Now, I'm not going to cover all of the different spin kicks in this video, but say for instance, if we were thinking about a spinning hook kick, where we would be losing movement in a spin hook kick if we were inefficient would be, say, having our arms too wide too late in the technique, so we're kind of dragging ourselves through. Maybe the kick comes out at the wrong time, the chambers are all wrong and things like that. And if all of these things don't line up in a technique, that's where we're kind of losing all that momentum and it starts to slow down, become inefficient and much more readable. So the first thing to do in refining these techniques is to make sure the prerequisites are there nice and strongly. And prerequisite basically means the parts that kind of build up into the more advanced version of a technique. So for instance, if you're wishing to execute a spin hook kick, then you need to have a really nice standing hook kick. If you wish to execute a spinning back kick, you need a nice standing side kick and so on. And don't delude yourself that you don't need to practice these and you can just go straight to the advanced version, because if you haven't got that foundation, then it doesn't matter how much spinning or any momentum you add on. If that baseline isn't there, the kick's just not going to work because you aren't going to understand the correct biomechanics to make it effective. When progressing to spinning techniques, the main component that we need to focus on here is torque. And torque is basically the force at which an object rotates around an axis. So in case of a spinning kick, for instance, our base leg and our body will be the axis that we rotate around, and it's about getting all of the energy to transfer from the leg through the body and then discharge into the leg at the end. And because of that, the most important thing in these spinning kicks that makes them work, and also why most people aren't able to do them, is because their body is disjointed and not working together. So there's heavy importance here about getting all of the energy nice and contained within the body. The body isn't compromised in any way, so that we're able to transfer all that energy into the kick at the end and not lose any throughout. When the form is good in a spinning kick, the energy basically builds all the way through the technique up until right at that last point when it's discharged into the target when we choose. However, if the form is bad in one of these kicks, then you might initially start well and generate sufficient energy, but if your body's compromised throughout, then it kind of depletes more and more until the point when we get to the kick at the end, we've got very little energy left and it becomes kind of weak and ineffective, which is often where you see people with these kind of really floppy and weak looking kicks. It's a timing issue as well, so you need to make sure that your body is lined up correctly at the right time of throughout these techniques in order to kind of carry that energy through. So if I generate a nice amount of potential energy through my initial spin as I begin the technique, but then, for instance, if I'm lagging behind by the time it gets to the chamber, then that energy I initially generated basically has nowhere to go. And if I'm not in that correct position for the next part of the technique, then it just kind of is lost from the body. So you often see this with people when they're kind of having to almost course correct as they go through a technique because, say, one of those stages was off. So when that happens, it looks quite robotic and mechanical rather than very natural and fluid. A way to illustrate this would be using the analogy, say, of a motorbike accelerating down a course with a jump at the end, and it needs to reach a certain speed in order to be able to complete that jump effectively. Now, if it has a clean run and it just basically hits all the points as it goes down the ramp to that jump, then it will make it to the end. However, if it has to brake even very slightly before it reaches that ramp, then it's going to have lost some of its potential and it won't be able to make it over the jump. So now I'm going to talk about some practical tips on how you can improve these spinning kicks. So the first thing is obviously going to be your stance. So you want to have your stance where your center of gravity is nice and balanced. So if the stance is too narrow, then the center of gravity is going to be too on one point and it's going to be difficult to stay balanced throughout the duration of the kick. Conversely, if it's too wide, then you're going to struggle in order to spin quick enough from that wide stance. The next part we're going to speak about is generating that rotational force, and we're going to do this firstly by swinging our arms, but we need to swing our arms at the right time and retract at the right time as well, and this basically acts as a counterbalance as we spin round. So this is something you see with beginners a lot, is they won't use their arms enough in the kick and it ends up coming out slow because they don't generate that initial force needed for the kick. And if you use them too much and they're too wide for too long, then it's going to cause drag within the kick and make it really slow. And wherever the arms move, the body's going to follow shortly afterwards, so make sure you bear that in mind. At the same time the arms move, the hips move, and then the torso follows that. And at this point you should be engaging the core muscles to create a stable base. Remember when I said the whole body has to work as one throughout these techniques? This is only possible with a foundation of good stability. Point number 3 is chambering, extending and rechambering the leg at the right time. At all stages of a kick you need to be riding that energy at its peak, not behind or not ahead of it. If you're too slow lifting the initial chamber, the energy is going to be lost and you'll be playing catch up once again. However, if you lift that chamber too early, then you haven't allowed for the sufficient buildup of energy to occur, and so you're not going to have what it takes to complete the kick. The result of having off timing in your techniques means that the kick doesn't happen naturally and feels effortless, which is how it should feel when you get all of those points lined up correctly. And lastly, you're going to want to make sure that you're extending the kick at the correct point, just before the target, not too early or not too late. Again, this comes down to that arc of attack principle, which is basically the distance at which a kick travels across a target, not too early or not too late. The fourth point is going to be control of the body, and success in these techniques is always going to come down to the greater degree of control that you have, the better the kick's going to be afterwards. And this is why personally I'm a big advocate of everybody practicing these techniques, whether you intend to utilize them in sparring or you have a very kind of grounded martial arts style, because it's not always about utilizing, say, a flashy technique in a combat situation. It's more about the body awareness and control that you gain from practicing these techniques that then feeds into all the other areas of your martial arts practice. It essentially makes everything else that you do after that better and more easy, just because you have a much greater awareness and control of your physical body. As you become more comfortable and skilled with these techniques, then you're going to be able to play around with utilizing different levels of force and relaxation at different times in order to subtly change the kick. So for instance, if I wish to execute a powerful spinning hook kick where the momentum continues all the way through the technique until I return to my initial stance, then I'll engage my muscles more aggressively and hold for a slightly longer duration after kicking. So that results in a more aggressive rechamber, and then I return to that stance nice and effectively. Here I'm holding onto that energy right until the end of the technique and then letting it go once I return to stance. In counter to that, if I wish to execute a more relaxed version of the technique, then I might release the energy slightly earlier. I don't have to be as aggressive getting back into that stance, and I'll kind of come down much more softly. It's all about muscle control, and that's the key to mastering these techniques, is kind of really knowing and being in tune with your body. And this is achieved through what I call perfect practice as opposed to just practice. So people say practice makes perfect, but I prefer perfect practice makes perfect. Because what that means is essentially, if you're just practicing something and you don't really know what you're actually doing or where you're going wrong, then you're going to learn what may be an incorrect technique. Whereas perfect practice is having the awareness of what you're doing at each stage of a movement and practicing it that way, so that the only thing that your muscles are going to remember is how to do it correctly. And that can be done through repeating the movements slowly and mindfully, and then only adding speed and power once you're a little bit more comfortable with it. Don't worry about jumping into doing the kick super explosively quickly. We've all seen those people who try and, execute all of their punches really, really fast without really knowing what they're doing with the technique, and it just doesn't look right at all. It's the same with these kicks as well. With these tips, guys, I'm speaking about about the most efficient way to execute them without losing any energy throughout. So I don't want you to think that, say, if your timing is slightly off in one of these points, that the kick is going to fall apart and be useless essentially. What I'm talking about is the most efficient way, and that is achieved through consistent practice and understanding what you do in each stage of the movement. Nobody is 100% consistent and basically has like a copy-paste technique, so it looks exactly the same every single time they do it. There's always going to be slight nuance differences, but the more practice that you do for these, then you're going to get closer to that goal. So the goal should be to be able to do the technique literally the same every single time you do it, and the better you get at it, the more likely that is to happen. So I hope you enjoyed this video today, guys. As always, please subscribe and follow me on social media. The links will be appearing on the bottom of the screen right now. And if you wish to book a coaching call with me, you can click the link in the description. I'm now offering coaching calls as well, and I will see you in the next video.